The last thing Daniel Ferris heard before the world went black was his mother's voice, sharp and impatient, cutting through the pain in his chest like a blade. "We can't miss this flight because of you." He was lying on the hot asphalt of the airport parking garage, one hand clutched to his chest, his vision swimming, and above him stood the 4 people he had spent his entire adult life protecting. His father was checking his watch. His mother was gripping her passport like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. And his younger brother Kyle was already wheeling the luggage toward the terminal doors, not even bothering to look back. "Someone will help him," his father said, waving a hand dismissively, as if Daniel were a stalled car they could just leave on the shoulder of the road. "There are security guards everywhere. We have a flight to catch." Daniel tried to speak, tried to ask them to stay, but the words wouldn't come. His chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside, an invisible fist squeezing tighter with every second. He watched his family's silhouettes grow smaller against the bright terminal lights, dragging their designer suitcases toward a vacation he had unknowingly paid for. And then his eyes closed. To understand how a family could leave a dying man behind to catch a flight, you have to understand who Daniel Ferris was to them, and who they had always assumed he wasn't. Daniel was 38 years old, quiet, and almost painfully responsible. He had been the kind of child who cleaned up messes he didn't make, who apologized for things that weren't his fault, who learned early that love in his household was a limited resource, and it did not flow toward him. That love, what there was of it, had always been reserved for his younger brother Kyle. Kyle was everything Daniel was not. Loud, charming, reckless with money, allergic to responsibility. He had dropped out of 2 colleges, burned through 3 business ventures that Daniel quietly bailed out, and had been engaged twice to women who left the moment they realized his charisma was a coat of paint over an empty house. And yet, at every family dinner, every holiday, every gathering, Kyle was the one their parents beamed at. Kyle was going through a rough patch. Kyle was finding himself. Kyle was, in their eyes, the son with real potential, the one who just needed a little more support to make it big. Daniel, meanwhile, had built a life so quietly successful that his own family barely noticed it happening. He had started a logistics and supply chain consulting firm in his late 20s, working 18-hour days out of a cramped apartment, and by his mid-30s it had grown into a company with contracts across 3 countries. He drove a modest car. He wore plain clothes. He never talked about money at the dinner table because every time he tried, his mother would change the subject back to Kyle's latest idea, his newest girlfriend, his most recent almost success. What none of them knew, because Daniel never told them, was that for the past 6 years, he had been the one keeping the family afloat. The mortgage payment that mysteriously never fell behind, even the year his father lost his job. That was Daniel. The tuition for Kyle's second failed attempt at business school. Daniel. The medical bills when his mother needed knee surgery, the ones the insurance didn't fully cover. Daniel. The down payment on the house Kyle bought himself after his second failed startup, the one Kyle bragged about at every family gathering as proof he was finally getting his life together. That, too, had come from Daniel, wired quietly from an account with his name never mentioned, funneled through a family trust his parents assumed was some kind of inheritance windfall from his grandfather. They never asked too many questions. They preferred not to know. It was easier to believe Kyle was thriving and Daniel was just fine, stable. Unremarkable. The backup plan. The one who would always be there. The one who didn't need attention because he didn't seem to need anything at all. Daniel let them believe it. Not because he didn't crave their approval, but because somewhere along the way he had stopped expecting it, and giving quietly had become the only language of love he knew how to speak to people who never learned how to speak it back. The vacation that would change everything was supposed to be a 2-week trip to the Mediterranean, first-class flights, a rented villa on the coast, dinners at restaurants where the wine cost more than most people's rent. Daniel had paid for it, of course, though his parents told their friends they had finally saved up enough for the trip of a lifetime. He hadn't planned to go at first, but his mother had called him 3 weeks earlier, her voice syrupy in a way that only appeared when she wanted something. It would mean so much to have the whole family together, she'd said. Just this once. So Daniel rearranged his schedule, cleared 2 weeks off from a company that depended on him every single day, and agreed to drive everyone to the airport himself that morning, because his father's car was in the shop and Kyle's license had been suspended for reasons no one discussed at the table. He didn't complain. He never did. He loaded the suitcases, drove carefully through morning traffic, made easy conversation while his family talked over him about restaurants they'd researched and photos they planned to take. And then, in the parking garage, hauling the last of the luggage out of the trunk, Daniel felt something in his chest twist violently, like a wire pulled too tight and finally snapping. He stumbled. His vision blurred. A cold sweat broke across his skin in an instant, and pain radiated down his left arm in a way that some distant clinical part of his brain recognized immediately, even as panic swallowed the rest of him. He reached for the car to steady himself and missed, and the concrete rushed up to meet him. For a moment, there was only pain and confusion and the distant sound of his mother's voice, not asking if he was okay, not screaming for help, but snapping at his father about the time. "We're going to miss the gate!" His father knelt beside him for exactly 4 seconds, patted his shoulder in a way that felt more like an apology to himself than to Daniel, and said the words that would replay in Daniel's mind for the rest of his life. "Someone will help him. We have a flight to catch." And then, footsteps. Retreating. The wheels of suitcases rattling against pavement, growing fainter and fainter, until there was nothing but the pain and the cold and the terrible clarity that the people who were supposed to love him most had chosen a vacation over his life. It was a stranger, a woman in her 60s returning her rental car 2 rows over, who saw him collapse and ran toward him instead of away. She was a retired ICU nurse. She checked his pulse, found it dangerously irregular, and called 911 without hesitation, staying beside him, talking to him in a calm, steady voice, keeping him conscious just long enough for the paramedics to arrive. At the hospital, doctors would later tell investigators that Daniel had suffered a severe myocardial infarction, a heart attack caused by a blockage that had likely been building for months, invisible and unfelt until it wasn't. They said that had he gone even 15 to 20 more minutes without treatment, the outcome would almost certainly have been fatal. The stranger's quick action, not his family's, was the reason Daniel Ferris was alive at all. While Daniel lay unconscious in the cardiac unit, hospital administrative staff began the standard process of organizing his emergency paperwork, and that was when the first crack in the family's carefully maintained narrative began to show. The intake coordinator, a woman named Priya, pulled up his file to notify next of kin and found something unusual. Daniel Ferris was not, according to his own legal documents, a modestly comfortable consultant living paycheck to paycheck like his family assumed. He was the majority owner of a logistics firm valued in the 8 figures, the sole trustee of a family trust holding real estate and investment accounts, and the outright owner of 3 properties, including the very house his brother Kyle had been bragging about for 2 years. But more importantly, when Priya searched for an emergency contact, she found that neither of Daniel's parents nor his brother were listed anywhere in his files, not as emergency contacts, not as beneficiaries, not as anything at all. The only name listed with full medical and financial power of attorney was a woman named Carol Whitfield, a semi-retired attorney in her 60s who had been Daniel's mentor since his early 20s, back when he was a broke intern at a shipping company, and she was the in-house counsel who noticed his work ethic and took him under her wing. Over the years, as Daniel's family grew more distant and more demanding, Carol had become something his own parents never were, a steady, honest presence who simply showed up. When Daniel's family arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, having been pulled off their flight after airport security flagged the incident and law enforcement requested they return for questioning, they marched into the intensive care waiting area, expecting the deference they'd always assumed came with being his family. They were stopped at the door. "I'm sorry," the nurse told them, "but you're not listed as authorized contacts. I can't release any information or allow visitation without approval from his designated representative." His mother's face went white with a fury that had nothing to do with concern for her son and everything to do with confusion at being denied control. "That's ridiculous. I'm his mother. He's my son." "I understand this is difficult," the nurse said, "but I have to follow the documentation on file." That documentation, and the woman behind it, would soon unravel everything the Ferris family thought they knew about the son and brother they had left behind in a parking garage. The story might have ended quietly there, a private family reckoning behind hospital doors, if not for the stranger who had saved Daniel's life. Before the ambulance arrived, another traveler in the parking garage had filmed the final moments of the family walking away, Daniel motionless on the ground, his mother's voice audible on the recording, snapping about the flight. The bystander hadn't meant to create anything viral. She had simply been recording in case it was needed for a police report. But when the story of the medical emergency reached local news, a producer requested any available footage from witnesses, and the video was submitted. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 11 million times. The internet did what the internet does. Commenters dissected every second of footage, freezing on the moment Daniel's father patted his shoulder and stood up, freezing on the mother's face, more annoyed than afraid, freezing on Kyle, who never even turned around. News outlets picked up the story under headlines about family abandonment during medical emergencies. Ethicists and physicians were interviewed about bystander responsibility. Daniel's name was never released, out of respect for his privacy and ongoing recovery, but his family's faces were not so protected, having been caught clearly on camera and then further exposed when a local reporter, digging through the police report, identified them by name in a follow-up story about the police questioning that followed. Airport police had, in fact, questioned Ronald and Diane Ferris, along with Kyle, about why they left a family member in medical distress instead of seeking help or waiting for paramedics. No criminal charges were filed, since abandoning an adult family member during a medical emergency, however morally repugnant, wasn't itself illegal in that jurisdiction. But the reputational damage was instantaneous and total. Ronald's employer of 11 years placed him on indefinite leave, pending review, citing concerns about representing the company after the video's viral spread. Diane's book club, her volunteer group at church, and even her longtime hairdresser quietly stopped returning her calls. Kyle, who had built his entire persona on charm and social capital, found himself unfollowed, unfriended, and uninvited from the social circles he'd spent years cultivating. The vacation photos he had already posted, laughing beside a pool in a villa his brother unknowingly paid for, were dug up and recirculated with captions dripping in disgust. Their dream vacation, the one Daniel's near death had apparently not been worth interrupting, lasted exactly 1 week before they cut it short and flew home to a life that no longer resembled the one they'd left behind. It was Carol Whitfield who finally sat the family down. Nearly 2 weeks after the incident, once Daniel had stabilized and was recovering in a private room, still too exhausted to face them himself, she met Ronald, Diane, and Kyle in a small consultation room at the hospital, her expression unreadable, a thin folder resting on the table in front of her. "I think it's time you understood exactly who you left in that parking lot," she said. She explained, calmly and without embellishment, that Daniel had inherited a modest sum from his grandfather in his late 20s, an inheritance the family never knew existed because Daniel's grandfather had specifically left instructions that it be handled privately, believing correctly that if Ronald and Diane learned of it, they would feel entitled to a share. Daniel had used that initial inheritance not to buy himself comfort, but to seed his business, working relentlessly for years to grow it into something substantial. And once it was substantial, Carol continued, Daniel had made a decision that none of them ever detected. He began quietly supporting the very family that dismissed him. The mortgage, the tuition, the medical bills, the down payment on Kyle's house, every check, every wire transfer, every bailout the family attributed to luck, inheritance, or their own hard work had in fact come from Daniel, funneled anonymously through the trust so that no one would ever know, and no one would ever have to feel indebted to the son they'd never bothered to truly see. "He didn't want credit," Carol said quietly. "He wanted you to be okay. That's all he ever wanted." Diane's hands were shaking. Ronald stared at the table, unable to meet Carol's eyes. Kyle, for the first time in his adult life, said nothing at all. "He also," Carol added, sliding the folder across the table, "owns the house you're currently living in, Kyle. Has for 2 years. You've been paying what you thought was a mortgage into an account that simply forwards those payments back to cover your own utilities and expenses, because he didn't think you were ready to handle full financial independence yet, and he didn't want you to feel like a failure. He was still protecting you, even then." The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet, devastating sound of a family realizing they had spent years mistaking generosity for absence, mistaking humility for insignificance, and ultimately, mistaking the quiet son for the expendable one. Daniel's recovery took nearly 2 months, physical therapy included. His heart permanently altered but stable. His life fundamentally unchanged in its rhythms, except for one significant difference. The moment he was strong enough to sit at his own kitchen table and review his finances, he called Carol and asked her to begin the process of formally, legally, and permanently cutting his family off. It wasn't rage that drove the decision. Not entirely. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after your body nearly stops working and the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally choose a flight schedule over your life. The mortgage payments stopped first. Within 3 months, Ronald and Diane received a notice from the bank that their account was behind, the automatic backup payments that had silently covered any shortfalls for years having vanished without explanation. They scrambled, humiliated, forced for the first time in over a decade to actually manage their own finances without a silent safety net beneath them. Kyle's situation collapsed even faster. The utility payments stopped. The maintenance fund that had quietly covered his car payments and his lifestyle dried up within weeks. He was forced to sell the house he'd bragged about for 2 years, the one he never knew he didn't actually own outright, and move into a modest apartment, taking a sales job he would have once considered beneath him. Meanwhile, Daniel's business partners and colleagues, many of whom had watched the viral video without knowing it involved their own quiet, unassuming CEO, learned the truth when local press eventually connected the dots after his company issued a statement thanking the stranger who saved his life. Instead of pity, what Daniel received from his professional world was something he had never truly gotten from his family: respect. Genuine, unforced respect for a man who had built something remarkable while carrying an emotional weight none of them had known about, and who had somehow remained kind despite it. The confrontation his family had been dreading and secretly hoping might offer some kind of resolution finally happened 4 months after the incident, when Ronald, Diane, and Kyle showed up unannounced at Daniel's office, having exhausted every phone call and email he'd left unanswered. He agreed to see them, not out of forgiveness, but out of a need for closure he hadn't realized he needed until they were sitting across from him. Diane spoke first, her voice cracking in a way that might have moved him once. "We panicked, Daniel. We weren't thinking clearly. We love you. You have to know that." Ronald nodded along, murmuring agreement, and Kyle stared at the floor, silent, for once without a charming excuse ready on his tongue. Daniel let the apologies finish. He let the silence stretch afterward, long enough that his mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, long enough that his father cleared his throat twice as if to fill the void with something, anything. Then Daniel asked the only question that mattered. "If I had died that day, on that pavement, would you have even missed your flight?" No one answered. Diane opened her mouth and closed it again. Ronald looked away. Kyle, who had built an entire identity on quick words and easy charm, found he had none. The silence in that office said more than any apology ever could have. "That's what I thought," Daniel said quietly, and it wasn't cruel. It was simply, finally, honest. He didn't yell. He didn't demand they leave. He simply stood, thanked them for coming, and told them that Carol would be handling any further communication regarding the family trust, which, effective that week, no longer included any of them as beneficiaries, present or future. The properties were being restructured. The financial support, visible and invisible, was over, permanently and irreversibly. In the months that followed, Daniel redirected the resources he had once poured quietly into a family that never noticed him into something with his name on it for the first time in his life. Not out of vanity, but out of a desire to build something that reflected who he actually was, rather than who his family needed him to pretend to be. He established a foundation providing emergency medical assistance grants to individuals who, like the stranger who had saved him, understood that a life mattered more than a schedule, more than money, more than convenience. He funded